So good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be together again in what continues to be pretty tumultuous times. We're certainly thinking of all of our colleagues in California that are busy evacuating patients and really struggling with the fires on top of the pandemic. So I think our session today is very, very appropriate. Let's bring ourselves here into this time and place as we always do. So close your eyes if you wish to. Find your place in your chair, your feet on the floor. Listen to the rhythm of your heart. Find that place of quiet as you let go of whatever the day has been, and you let whatever the day will be wait, so that we can be here in this time and place together. So we'll take a moment just to be quiet together as others join as they will. Thank you. So today we have a special speaker with us, Dr. Amitha Kalaichandran. Dr. Kalaichandran wrote an article in The Atlantic in April that caught our attention. The article was entitled, "We Are Not Ready for This Kind of Grief." And remarkably, and perhaps sadly, it's as relevant or more relevant today than it was when it was published in The Atlantic in April. Amitha Kalaichandran is a physician, an epidemiologist, a speaker, a nonfiction writer who has also been widely published, including in such periodicals, including the New York Times, Wired, The Atlantic, Scientific American, the Boston Globe, among many others. She is truly a Renaissance woman. She has many avid interests. She serves as a health and wellness coach and also a yoga and mindfulness teacher. Amitha, we are so pleased to have you with us today, and we're really looking forward to hearing you speak to us. As you know, we are social workers, we are bereavement specialists, and spiritual care providers to patients and families at the end of life. So welcome. We're really glad to have you here today.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for that very kind introduction. So I was asked to speak today on the topic of grief, as I wrote an article in The Atlantic that many of you might have read, which is about grief during COVID. So obviously the NPHI is an organization that has an immense role to play always, and especially now, especially with end-of-life care. So grief is really a big part of what all of you deal with day in and day out, and especially now during COVID. But innovation is also part of your mandate. And so during this time, I mean, we're now about 7 months into this worldwide pandemic. I thought instead that I would talk about a story that very recently changed how I understood grieving, particularly as COVID has caused us to really view grief differently and view it as something that's not just restricted to that feeling that comes with when we lose a loved one. And the story that inspired me and really got me thinking was actually a biblical story, and it's the story of the book of Job. And even though I wasn't brought up Christian, it fundamentally changed how I view grief. And I know that there are chaplains on this call or chaplains that are part of NPHI, so feel free to correct me during the Q&A or at the end if there's anything that I've missed or misinterpreted. But But I would start there, and then I'll get into an artist that really got me to rethink the book of Job and how it applies to what all of us are facing now. So there are 3 books in the Bible known as the wisdom literature: the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And the first 2 books effectively deal with the wisdom of God, that God is fair. So an eye, for instance, good deeds are rewarded, bad deeds are punished, and that sometimes life can be unpredictable, and sometimes good deeds go unrewarded and bad deeds may not be punished in the way we'd expect. And the book of Job comes next, and that is really where there's an intention to reconcile the first 2 books. And the story starts off in the command center in heaven, where God is conferring with the sons of God, including one named Satan. And Satan the word translates to the opposition or the adversary. So the one who effectively raises questions about how God is running things. So they then discuss Job, and Job is a wealthy but generous man who lives on earth. He has many children, he has flocks of sheep and other animals, a loving wife, and he's a good and kind neighbor. But most importantly, he's a righteous man of faith. And Satan essentially suggests that maybe Job is only a man of faith because God has rewarded him with all of these earthly things. So in other words, his faith is conditional on having been granted a very good life, and that perhaps as a test of his faith, he should have all of these things taken away. So God agrees to this experiment, and the story progresses. So Job loses everyone and everything he cares about. His children are killed, as are his animals. He loses his home. And to make things worse, his health suffers mentally due to all of his losses, but also physically. So for extra measure, Satan gives him all of these painful boils all over his body. Job almost feels like he's dying. And at first, early on, Job still praises God. He still is a man of faith. He doesn't question his faith. However, in the 3rd chapter, we see that the facade begins to fall. So he goes on to write all of this poetry where he describes his devastation and his suffering. And his friends, even his own wife, begin to wonder if maybe Job had done some type of an evil deed that deserved all of this suffering. And because there's this understanding that God is fair, and so Job must have done something to deserve all of those losses, which just makes things worse. He effectively feels even more alone now that his friends and his wife clearly don't believe that he's an innocent man. And there are multiple chapters that are dedicated to this questioning. He goes back and forth around whether he thinks God is fair. He's conflicted, and at times he has faith and trusts in God's wisdom, and other times he questions if God is good at all. At one point, he just wonders if God is corrupt. And he progresses through all of the stages of grief, which include denial. And finally, he gets to a point where he just demands that God explain his actions. And so a dark storm emerges, and God appears, and they have a conversation, and God doesn't explain the experiment. He doesn't explain Satan, but he does allow Job to accompany him on a tour of the vast universe. And it becomes clear that there's much more that God must coordinate over time and space, all of the lives he's responsible for. And so any one life like Job's plays a very tiny part. And in other words, the universe and every event is much more complex than any human mind could ever comprehend, that no human could possibly understand the purpose of any one blessing or curse, and that it's simply impossible to reward every good deed or punish every bad deed. And at the end of his tour with Job, God praises 2 animals, Leviathan and Behemoth. And Job protests and says, these animals are dangerous. They would kill us. They would kill me if I was in front of them, and therefore they must be evil. And God disagrees. So from his perspective, from God's perspective, they're still part of God's creatures. And then Job is left with a greater understanding of his faith. He doesn't really have an explanation for what happened, an explanation for his suffering, but he has a bit of peace, and he's humbled. And then the book ends in a really surprising way. So God then returns everything that Job has lost: his children, his health, his animals, his home. So the story at first blush suggests that faith can be tested, but that the faithful may still be rewarded. It's also a story of one man's grief and how powerful it can be as a test of faith. But that's not it. And it really wasn't until I came across a series of drawings by William Blake that another bigger element of the story became obvious. And this is the most relevant aspect to us today as we're dealing with COVID. So in the Tate Britain, which is an art museum in London, there's a small section dedicated to the art and life of William Blake. So for those of you who are not familiar with him, Blake was an 18th century poet who was also a mystic. So he would get these visions that would come to him from angels. He would get visions from his brother who had passed away. And these would inspire his gorgeous paintings. He was a very spiritual man, and he would create these stunning oil-based paintings that would have spiritual elements with halos above his subjects and that sort of thing. And they hang in museums all over the world. They're incredibly stunning. But to me, his most interesting work is actually a collection of 22 sketches. And there's 22 because it includes a title page, and he did these sketches with pencil. And these were completed in 1823, and each drawing is accompanied by beautiful calligraphy. And it's worth noting that as a teenager, William Blake's father was quite concerned about his what William Blake might be when he grows up, and so he suggested that he apprentice with an engraver to hone his skills in very fine engraving, so that he had a backup plan, I guess, if the art thing didn't work out. And so that explains really how detailed and technically complex these sketches are. They almost resemble etchings. And what was the subject of these set of drawings? Well, the subject was the Book of Job. So he became obsessed with the story, and no one really knows why. There's some thought that it might have been because of the death of his brother, but we don't really know why he became so preoccupied with the Book of Job. And you received a link to the sketches ahead of my talk, and there's 3 sketches in that set that I wanted to talk about today. So the second sketch, or second plate, the 6th sketch, and the last plate, which highlight to me what the Book of Job is really about and how it might inform us as we navigate our own feelings of grief and process of grief during COVID. So taking a look at the second sketch, which is plate 2, we see the immense abundance in Job's life. So he's sitting, he's surrounded by his animals, his wife, his children. He looks calm. His family is looking upwards to the heavens to symbolize that they are people of faith. And we see God sitting above and the sons of God underneath. The way that Blake has sketched this particular scene, it's really interesting because it appears that Job and his family can't see Satan lurking below God. But the viewer, or looking at the sketch, we see that it looks like it is an ominous sign. And there's a line that Blake writes in calligraphy. So Job chapter 21, verse 5, where he writes, "When the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were about me." And that is really an important point because it's the last moment when everything was quote unquote normal. So just before things hit the fan. And this is a really good image to think about as we think about our lives before COVID. So where were you? What did you have? Which loved ones were still alive before the pandemic picked up steam in the US in February and March? So keep that in mind. And plate 6, though it's only a quarter of the way through the story, is to me the most important plate. And it's the larger message in the Book of Job, which affords us a key lesson. So we see in that sketch that Satan is torturing Job with boils. In the background, there's an ominous cloud, and visually it's stunning, and there's all kinds of symbolism there that we can get into, but it's a very sinister image. And the words that Blake chose to write above are key. So chapter 1, verse 21, it reads, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away." So the Book of Job isn't just about grief or just about faith. The broader message is actually about our attachments. So the pain that comes with attaching ourselves and our identities, as well as our faith, to the things and people we have in our lives, to have our identities and life worth be conditional and have our faith be conditional on these attachments. And that is the source of our suffering. Our grief, whether it's a prolonged or complicated form that keeps us stuck and hopeless, or something else, is just a symptom of these greater processes of attachment. So as people who work in hospice as grief counselors, social workers, bereavement experts, chaplains, you've seen a lot of loss personally and professionally. And what's new perhaps with COVID is that we're seeing grief take many new forms. So there's the obvious form, which is secondary to losing a loved one. And there's also the not so obvious, so mourning our old life or life before COVID. And this includes jobs for millions of people, the activities we used to enjoy, and so on. And it's made even more challenging with the underlying uncertainty, these feelings of when will this end or get back to normal, even though we know deep down it will never be normal if we define normal as the same as it was before. So we're in this process of mourning that old way of life and that old normal. So when working with your patients and clients, then the job becomes not just facilitating discussions about death, but also facilitating conversations about collective grief around our previous lives. And this is why framing things in terms of attachments might make a lot of sense. So it's the material attachments, but also the attachments that we have with our loved ones, including our memories and the experiences we use to define our identities. So grief is, at its origin, really related to having to let go when we don't want to. And it's not just a feeling, it's a process. And it's a process that is part of recognizing our attachments. So when we think back and get curious to the moment before COVID really hit, or our sketch 2, in other words, it can get really interesting. So think back to when things felt normal for you, when you felt almost innocent and totally unaware of what was to come. So for me, 2 dates really stick out. So the first is January 30th, and I was emailing with someone at the time, and I had come across a story in the New York Times. It was a very short piece, and there was a graph about this mysterious virus. And for some reason or another, that particular story stuck out to me and concerned me, even though there were no known cases in the US at the time. But I had just realized that something was amiss, and it felt to me that things were going to get really, really bad, that it wasn't just an epidemic in Asia that would just die out. It would get worse. And so I had written in an email to a friend, I sent him the link to the story and just said, it feels like it's going to get really bad. And then 2 days later, New York had its first reported cases. So that is one particular date that will be in my mind forever. And the second date was March 13th. And that was a night that I went to dinner with a friend of mine. It was in New York. We had dinner inside. They had just started the physical distancing, but no one was wearing masks. And New York City still had some semblance of normalcy. And I remember where we sat in the restaurant. I remember what we ordered, what we wore, like it's etched into my memory forever, because the following day, most restaurants in the city shut down, as did many other businesses, except for the most essential. And over the following weeks, there would be sirens, like ambulance sirens, which would become normal background noise. And at one point, I timed it once, and they were spaced out about every 5 minutes. And then there were thousands of cases. New Yorkers would be locked in their apartments afraid. It would, the city would turn into this ghost town. And there was so much uncertainty. We didn't know what the symptoms were. There was so much misinformation and fear, a lot of flip-flopping of advice around masks and no masks, because the public health messaging hadn't yet caught up to the science, and the science was changing. And so it was a very difficult and uncertain time. And so those were 2 lines in the sand, 2 discrete moments of mourning where I had to manage my attachment to how things were. And those moments may never be relived. They mark moments of normalcy in terms of the old normal. And so when we think about how we're feeling now, looking back at those early months especially, as well as the present time, and what and who we are attached to now, which may effectively cease to exist when the year is up, whether it's jobs or loved ones who may be unwell, or something entirely different. And to understand that even our regular mourning process, which is a centuries-old rite of passage, is also subject to the same grief, because we're not able to grieve this in the same way that we've done for years, decades, because of the limitations in terms of gatherings and so forth. And for most of us, it's these rites, whether it's attending a wedding or planning a trip abroad, gatherings like birthdays and funerals, that really comprise the tapestry of life. And so they take on a very different and more somber version now. And interestingly, back to Blake just for a moment, he was also a poet, and he published 2 famous works of poetry, one called Songs of Innocence, which was published in 1789. And then after living through the French Revolution, he published part 2, which was Songs of Experience in 1794. And the subtitle of those collections is The Two Contrary States of the Human Soul. And this really reflects what he would later sketch in the book of Job, and just that duality around how God could allow for both good and evil, innocence and experience. And 2 of his best known poems from that collection is one poem called The Lamb, which represents innocence, and the second called The Tiger, which represents experience. And so all of us, when we think about who we were and what our world was like before COVID, it very much is like that innocent period. And now we're coming out of that experience as a more experienced society, hopefully a wiser society. It's still not over, but we can feel, I think, at some fundamental level, intrinsic level, that we are changed. And so a lot of what we're facing and dealing with now is grieving that, all of those losses that we had to endure in order to get to this more wise place. And so that then brings me to the last point that I wanted to touch on, which is the last image of Blake's series on Job. So we've covered the first plate, which was plate 2, the moment that Job loses everything he most cares about. The second plate, which is plate 6, when Blake emphasizes that the Lord can release these attachments, even if, or perhaps because of how tightly we hang on to them. And then the last plate, which is plate 21. So taking a look at that, it's a pretty simple image compared to the first, like plate 2, or if you've taken a look, even plate 1, where there's just so much abundance. And it looks like things are back to as they were. God has returned everything that Job has lost: his children, his animals, his home, his health, plus more. And Blake is really encapsulating chapter 42, verse 12 of the book of Job, which reads, "So the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep and 6,000 camels and 1,000 yoke of oxen and 1,000 donkeys." So he got everything back plus more, according to the book. But interestingly enough, Blake doesn't write that line on the sketch. He picks a line from Psalm 139 instead, which reads, "How precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand." And it's fitting that he chose this line, because when you look at the image, it's with Job and his daughters. He's sharing his newfound wisdom and understanding. We can see how happy he appears now. But those familiar with the story and also with the series of sketches know that this image isn't just a carbon copy of the second plate with Satan removed. It's far from it. And Blake didn't do that, I think, on purpose, to reflect that there's a new wisdom there and a new understanding that we are more than our attachments, that Job is more than his attachments. He doesn't need to be surrounded by all of these animals and all of this abundance to feel abundant inside. He doesn't need those attachments to understand his purpose, or to understand or to appreciate his faith. And Job has become, in this last sketch, clearly a fundamentally changed man after having gone through such tribulations that would test him, his faith, his sense of self and purpose. And that life is unpredictable, that loss can occur, and loss does occur. It's inevitable. It's so inevitable, in fact, that it's echoed in most major religions, especially in Buddhism, which centers around how the source of our suffering isn't really what happens to us, but can be traced instead to our attachments. And that true enlightenment, contentment, joy, happiness comes from renouncing these attachments, which is why Buddhist monks tend to renounce the material world and live ascetically, free from material things. But even without that renunciation, we can remind ourselves that everything is temporary, and that the only constant, paradoxically, is this constant state of change. So we're constantly in flux, in other words, even though that sounds like a paradoxical statement. And so you've read my Atlantic piece, and you know that it's framed around a novella that was written by Catherine Porter called Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which was inspired by her own grief after the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. And the title she chose was, in fact, another biblical story. It was a reference to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And the pale horse in that story represents the conqueror, and the dark horse represents death. And the term dark horse is really interesting because It's a term that we use to imply something or someone that comes up from behind unexpectedly or unpredictably. So Abraham Lincoln was a dark horse when he was elected. COVID arguably was a dark horse that most of us could never have imagined or predicted. And it's these moments, these dark horses, that can sometimes lead to a personal and societal reckoning. Often it's these dark horses that are tragic and unwanted, but sometimes they're exactly what we need. The invigorated racial justice movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, specifically after the murder of George Floyd, are examples. It's not necessarily that we're always worried and upset at losing our old way of life. Sometimes we can actually be grateful that we're being forced to move forward and let go of old norms that may have been keeping our society stuck and causing a lot of pain. The pain of systemic racism and police brutality, for example. And sometimes we most need a tipping point. So a tipping point meaning the spread of compassion and progressive ideals that can happen when we have such extreme events in our lives. And other times the lesson is a tripwire, the destruction of harmful ideals that have kept our society tethered and trapped for too long. And these are all moments in Blake's second sketch where there's a line in the sand that clearly marks our lives before and our lives after. So where does all of this leave us now as we think back to how our attachments have fueled our grief and perhaps also our faith in what's to come? Could it be that what's to come could in fact be better and a healthier, more just world? That we have the opportunity to become more evolved as a society? Is it true that sometimes evolution can sometimes look like destruction to the untrained eye and the untrained heart? And what's the role that each of you play in shepherding that for yourselves and your clients, even while having more compassionate discussions with them and yourselves? I think it leaves us with a challenge to treat our attachments not just as the root of suffering, but instead to be conscious about using it as fuel that, when released from us, even unwillingly, can propel us forward as opposed to keeping us tethered to our past. And a fellow friend of mine, Barrett Swanson, recently wrote an essay for the New Republic, and it was a great essay about this novelist. And there's a line in there that I absolutely loved that he gave me permission to share with you today, and it encapsulates this message exactly. So in reflecting on the death of the novelist, Barrett writes, "If all we are when we die is how we exist in other people's memories, then it is the duty of the living to properly remember our dead, to cautiously draw the contours of their nuanced and many-edged existence." So I just love that sentence so much. And the reference to contours and edges is echoed in William Blake's literal framing of each of these moments in the book of Job, about accepting tragedy and pain that's secondary to our attachments as part of a life well lived and part of a life well loved, while not allowing it to keep us stuck, and challenging ourselves to treat these memories of that past and reflections as things that provide us with meaning and purpose as we move forward. So we still honor our old lives and those that we lost, our previous selves, but we remain open as to what's to come. And as difficult as it is now in the midst of a pandemic, as it was for Job for most of that story during his suffering, it's possible and in fact probable that after the cycle of pain we feel as individuals and collectively, that we can emerge with a greater understanding of ourselves, a greater understanding of faith, if you're a person of faith, and our purpose. And it's important to remember that the word healing, as we know it, is actually derived from the word whole. So healing is effectively a return to wholeness, not a return to sameness, not a rehashing of our old lives or a rehashing of an old picture or sketch, but something that's entirely new, but still whole. And that's why many of the dying can be healed as they are dying, as unusual as it is for our minds to put those things together, because especially in my training in medicine, we don't typically equate healing with death. We presume them to be opposites, that death is failure. But that's a false idea. You can be healed in death. And trees in nature teach us all of these lessons too. So every winter here, where I am in Toronto and in much of the US where there's snow, the deciduous trees lose their leaves. So these leaves nourish the soil and the soul. They feed the tree and thus support the sprouting of new leaves the following spring. But when you look up on a midwinter's day, you might notice that there's always some of these old leaves that remain stubbornly stuck to the branches, even in the middle of winter. And they poke out through the snow. And these are the leaves that have refused to let go. And botanists have a term for this. It's called marcescence, the adjective meaning marcescent. So these leaves that stay stuck in their attachment are marcescent. And I think it's really profound as we think about what we're dealing with now, that we can decide consciously to stay stubbornly on our proverbial tree branch, on our, wanting this old life that we used to have, wanting things to be the same as they always were, and refusing to accept this new normal. Or we can be brave and propel ourselves forward and cultivate some curiosity about what this new purpose might unveil. And ultimately, that's the lesson in the book of Job, as elucidated by William Blake's sketches, that Job's faith reached a whole new level once and only when he was totally surrendered, when he could finally release the attachments he had to his old life, to understand his purpose and meaning as transcending any one item or person he had attached to and loved, and to understand his part in a wider universe and cosmos. And when I think about this pandemic and what most of us are experiencing now, personally and professionally, while grief is certainly part of it, that process is a derivative of a larger idea around our attachments and our individual and collective experiences with suffering during this time. And these will have ripple effects across time and geography. So we must choose whether we will allow it to propel us forward or keep us stuck and hopeless. And Job had the benefit of journeying across the universe to understand that his life or any one event was a very tiny part of the bigger picture. We have the benefit of being his apprentices. And that's an idea we can find some comfort in during this challenging time as individuals and as you go forth when you connect with your clients and patients. Thank you.
Amitha, thank you. Wow, so much in what you shared with us. We want to open up the conversation to some Q&A. A couple of reflections that I have. One of the things that came up for me when you were speaking was, I've had to shift my language. I used to talk about what the silver linings were, and I realized that that wasn't reverential of the 170,000 plus folks just in our country, let alone around the world, who have lost their lives, to the suffering of so many people. So I've shifted that to what are the learnings? What are we being taught, and what can we learn, and how do we take that into what you were calling a different or new normal? I won't even call it normal, a new reality in some ways. I was also struck, I think what you said was this new wisdom of Job, the returned bounty of his life was really more of an internal bounty than it was all of his oxen and sheep, et cetera, et cetera. And, in hospice, Frank Ostaseski says, we all come to this work out of our woundedness in some ways. And in many ways, you're saying to us that we need to work on our grief and our process and our attachments as we encounter all of our coworkers and what's next. I guess my question is, what do you think we can expect? I mean, one of the things we've talked about is what will especially our grief support programs, what will we be seeing? In some ways, because we're not only seeing folks that have lost loved ones, but also this loss of assumptive world, really whatever was normal, and how do we, so what's your sense about what's coming around that phenomena, if you will?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question. And I love that you mentioned that quote about sort of this woundedness, because Rumi has this really beautiful quote about, I can't remember the exact wording, but the wound is where the light enters you. And Leonard Cohen has a similar line in one of his songs too. So I think sort of starting from that theme of, understanding that the pain is real. It's not something that we should be pushing away or denying. And that approaching, I guess, moving forward and what's to come is really to understand that it's not going to be a linear process. Grief and letting go and surrendering and recognizing that, things that we maybe took for granted in the past, or people we took for granted in the past that may no longer be with us. All of those things that was part of our old way of life may be transformed in some way, and that there will be days and times when it will be very difficult to accept that, and days and times where it will be a little bit easier. And I think that that's really, in terms of what's to come, is to really understand that it'll be a very unique process for everybody. And I think coming together collectively, being present with loved ones during this time of suffering, encouraging the cultivation of curiosity, I think is really, really important. I think something that I've learned in recent years is that feeling of wonder and curiosity can be a really interesting space to be when you find yourself, or when you find yourself working with someone who is in the depths of their pain and their grief. It's because it becomes a question of, instead of why me, or why is this happening, and this is horrible, which are all true things, can it be shifted to, what might be ahead? What else might be, not the silver lining aspect, because I agree with you, but what might be ahead that could be positive in a sense.
Yeah, thank you. You also said something about how, I'll paraphrase, that there can be great learning and texture and quality in dying, and that in medical school, I've never been, but I'm going to guess that that's not exactly what we learn. And yet in our work in hospice, we run into folks and I thought about this when you were talking, that who accompany their loved ones at the end of life. And they say, it was the hardest thing I ever did and the best thing I ever did. And there's that both end, right? In terms of, and I think we know that there is an incredible quality and texture to life at the very end of life that we're privileged to encounter. And I think what we experience in accompanying folks is that maybe letting go, and realizing that a lot of what we have been attached to is not I think that it distills out into the very essence of what's important, in a sense. And we're really privileged to experience that. Can you comment on that in terms of what you had to say to us?
Yeah, I think exactly what you were saying about how, that makes a lot of sense. If shepherding someone or accompanying someone during that, I guess, last period in their, I guess, bodily existence, I think can be a very profound experience. And I think that it really calls to question what it means to heal. And you're right, like in medicine, it very much is, death is equated with failure. We do everything we possibly can to prevent it from happening. And I think in recent years, a lot of people have come to a new understanding of that. And yeah, I think that being present with someone towards the end of life is an incredibly profound and humbling experience. And just understanding again that is the ultimate surrender, that is the ultimate letting go, the ultimate renunciation, and that we're always in this process of letting go constantly. So every day it becomes a question of, what are you letting go of today? And what is hard to surrender today, and why is it so challenging? Why is this particular attachment to this thing or this person or this element that feels very attached to your identity or sense of self? If it was to disappear, how would you be different, or how would you be the same? I think those are really important questions to ask ourselves, and especially during times like, during this time where we're constantly, everything is sort of top speed in terms of what we're having to let go, and the uncertainty of it all. But we can find some type of groundedness in, I think, entertaining that curiosity,
Yeah, yeah. And I think that as we get connected to this idea of impermanence, that everything changes and transforms, it calls us to be right in the moment, which may be the only, in a weird way, safe place, is to in the right here and now. And again, we're back to what is our process as caregivers. Um, what's your sense about how the healthcare professionals, for sure, of whom we are a part, what this has been like? Has it been different than anything you've seen in the past? I was listening this morning to an ER physician in Florida just talking about how can you be the same when you're holding the hand of someone who's not with their family at the end of life because of the contagion issues, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
What's your sense about how we as healthcare professionals can, grow in this time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely been a test for many people in the healthcare field. I think I mentioned in my Atlantic article a conversation I had with a good friend of mine who's an emergency medicine doctor in New York City, and just the pure overwhelm of COVID, and almost, to him, it almost felt like he was drowning, and then that sense of futility and helplessness that accompanies that, and I guess this sort of I think what it can do in terms of moral courage and some of the wounds there. Again, sort of this idea that those of us in the healthcare field especially perhaps equate failure with death with failure. And there's just many of those questions around, is there anything more we can do? Navigating even more uncertainty. I think the uncertainty is probably the biggest thing that has shifted things for people, because there's always uncertainty in medicine. Medicine is not an exact science. Healthcare is not an exact science. But with COVID, the uncertainty is just through the roof. We don't know. There's so much we don't know. And especially in the early days, healthcare professionals were really tasked with, do we give this patient this or that? Do we do this test or that test? Is it safe to let them go? Is it not? Who gets a ventilator? All of these questions that, in our lifetime, most people haven't had to deal with. And then when it comes to hospice, it's a totally different, other totally different challenges around end of life. Maybe those individuals that maybe would not have typically been at the end of life had this been a different virus or different time. And just the whole mourning process and grief process with family members not able to see their loved ones, at the end of their life. So the challenges are immense. It's almost as though things just became, top speed, very accelerated in terms of the lessons and the learning. And what's heartening, though, is I think hearing and seeing people come together. A lot of professions in the healthcare field tend to work, even though it's like there is a teamwork element, it tends to be quite individual, and people's experience tends to be quite individual. And I think that there's been a lot more sharing among healthcare professionals. I think a lot more interdisciplinary discussions, and in part probably because of the uncertainty, and we need everyone sort of at the table. So I think that that's a good sign, and I hope that that's something that will continue as a value in our healthcare system.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question about how do we help folks with depression or depressive tendencies to release attachments or work on this idea of letting go of old attachments as a way to ease their suffering?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. So someone once told me that depression at its core is sort of this attachment and this clinging to the past, whereas anxiety is this feeling that comes with worrying about the future. So they're very like past, and one is past, one is future. And I think, you know, clinical depression is obviously, it's complex. There are multiple factors. Part of the factors are in the individual, but most of it is environmental. Most of it is, you know, if you give a person who has depression, if you give them the right social support, if you put them in a healthy environment, if they have meaning and purpose in their lives, if they're sleeping well, you know, all of those things, you know, do amazing things for the mind, and for mood. Obviously there's a portion of it that is purely brain chemistry. But surprisingly, there a large number is situational or environmental. And so I think that when it comes to counseling someone that is feeling depressed, so whether it's clinical depression, which is defined as, you know, low mood for over 2 weeks, on more days than not, versus, you know, having a sad day here and there, which is normal. All of us should be feeling that because we're humans. It's really about meeting them where they are. You know, what is it? Is it something specific that has them down? You know, because if they've just lost their job and they're depressed, that's a pretty normal reaction. And I think sometimes in our society, we tend to label or pathologize things that are actually normal, in terms of if you have just gone through a loss, if you were not depressed, I would be worried about you. You know, so there's normal reactions to things, and normal reactions to this clinging of things that we were attached to. So losing a job, losing a loved one. And so meeting them where they are, showing compassion, getting them assistance where they, you know, with a psychotherapist, a good psychotherapist, working with them to help restore meaning and purpose. So if it's loss related, you know, if they've lost their job, can they find meaning and purpose with something else in the meantime, you know? Being solutions oriented. But really it's about meeting the person where they are, because sometimes patients and, you know, clients, they just want someone to be present with them, to listen to them. They may not need advice, per se. And a lot of us have this tendency sometimes to jump in and fix things. And that can be really great. But often what's needed is that sense of connection and just being there and being present. So that's where I would start, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I know that, I think, you know, for millennia, ritual has been a very important part of grieving. I just read a friend of mine lost a dear friend and was, you know, really agonizing over the inability to gather for a memorial service or to sit with the family, you know, all of those things that I think, you know, we have done culturally in so many different ways to memorialize and ritualize our grief, that I think helps us put one foot in front of the other. Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned that in hospice, you know, we do have, I think, what we call premature deaths, where folks are dying of the virus that you know, would have ideally lived longer lives. Mm-hmm. We also have patients that aren't dying of COVID, but that are unable to be attended to by family who aren't flying in, that are dying in a more isolated situation. Is all kinds of variations on what we would have considered to be normal, both in grief and both in accompanying the dying. And how would you suggest that we, in real time, adjust to that? Even like what we're doing today, you know, we're having this conversation through video, and we're doing that with grieving clients as well, through video chats and telehealth modalities that we never would have done. Again, I'm thinking back to your idea of what was normal and what's now new, right?
Definitely. And I think that, I think it's been really interesting to see how technology has transformed, and the role that technology plays during this time, because for years, and there's still so much research that talks about how social media or technology has really hindered our ability to connect. We're constantly on our screens, all of that sort of thing. But I think what's interesting with COVID, because we were forced to physically distance for health reasons, we've had no choice but to rely on our screens. And so then the question becomes, okay, how do we use this separateness that we are forced into to connect in maybe a different way? It doesn't necessarily mean a better way or a worse way, but what can we do to make, the use of screens and the use of technology healthier, and how can it help us connect, especially with end of life situations? And what's interesting too is, we do hear stories about people that wish that they could connect with their loved ones in person or attend a funeral in person, but also surprising things have come out of it. Maybe loved ones who maybe had been distant in the past have felt that everything that's happening with the pandemic has caused them to reflect on things. And so we're seeing some families come together who may not typically have come together at the end of someone's life. So yes, it's different and it's new, but it's not necessarily all negative. I think that there are some positive elements to it for sure. And again, it's just a challenge of how do you connect authentically through technology?
I think that's a great point. I think we're finding out that some of this works even better sometimes with certain clients who don't want to be face-to-face, or with teenagers that are used to doing video chats and their screens. And so that, again, that's the new, whatever the new reality is going to be for us. One last question before we close and let you go. We sure appreciate your time with us today. This is from some colleagues in Charlottesville that are saying that the whole community is still traumatized from the white supremacist attacks 3 years ago. What are your thoughts on how to heal a whole community? What would that look like to you? Yeah, it's
wow.
a tough one.
Yeah, that's yeah, that was such a tragedy, and such a beautiful question as well. And I think that cultivating compassion on an individual level and as a community is key. Understanding that what happened was so incredibly devastating, and there's no real, it's hard to make sense of tragedies like that. And I think what gives me hope, and I would hope would give Charlottesville and other communities that have dealt with similar types of tragedies hope, is that sometimes in that tragedy, there can be a coming together and a connection and a sense of community, a sense of love and compassion with one's neighbors. And I think that that's something to hold on to. And specifically, just as I mentioned earlier, this sense of meaning and purpose. As I think about COVID, as I think about some of these other very challenging tragedies that we've faced in the past, a lot of the time, what sometimes emerges is a profound sense of meaning and purpose. And we've seen that with, with other instances of school shootings, for example, where high schoolers have come together and, they might have planned to go to college and planned to do all those things and planned to study X, Y, and Z. And now, like, what, I still want to do that, but I also feel that my life's purpose and calling is really to prevent this from happening to anybody else. And so there's this renewed sense of meaning. And there's something in that. There's something in when, as individuals and as communities, when we come together and we realize that we can almost transform a given experience, a tragedy. It's almost like alchemy, you know, it's like you're spinning gold and you're spinning this purpose and this meaning and you're creating it. And it gives us the sense of well-being and just purpose. And I think I would hold on to that as an element of healing.
Yeah, that's lovely. It occurs to me that maybe there's a communal Job experience. And trying to relate to what were we and what are we now in terms of our attachments, and there may be a process that not only works on us as individuals but also maybe communally as well.
Definitely.
Well, we are at the end of our time together. Very much appreciate your being with us today. Can't thank you enough. I think I'm going to read a very short poem from Judah Halaby to close our session today. It's entitled, "'Tis a Fearful Thing." And this is how it's written. "'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch. A fearful thing to love, to hope, to dream, to be. To be and oh, to lose. A thing for fools, this, and a holy thing to love. For your life has lived in me, your laugh once lifted me, your word was gift to me. To remember this brings painful joy. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing to love what death has touched." Okay, everybody. Thank you so much. We'll see you all next month. Amitha, thank you again.
Thank you so much. Take care.
So long.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.